the web is faster than us. Okay, dear friends, welcome to this webinar. I'm glad that we can discuss this issue. The idea to have this first discussion first, because I hope we will have others. The idea came mainly from Michele, and it was in the aftermath of the anniversary of the Workers' Statute, the Italian Act of 1970, which is a masterpiece of the Italian legislation, not many others, which set, in fact, the basic workers' rights and also the rights of the trade unions in the enterprise. And since it was the anniversary and times have changed very much, in fact, we were almost in the middle of the pandemic, and we said, why don't we imagine some sort of rejuvenation or innovation or of this piece of legislation, but in general, not only the Italian piece of legislation. We are convinced that it is still the case worth thinking of on workers' rights in the place of work and in general in the labor market. We presented some ideas. I don't know if Michele has sent you a prototype of this idea of adapting the original version of the Workers' Statute to the new environment of the firm, that is the digitalized firm. In fact, we imagine how single individual pieces of the legislation could be adapted, both concerning the unions' activities and the protections of the individual employees. That was the original idea. The discussion in the council, here in this council, did not go further. In fact, there was a sort of negative reaction mainly. It's not, we have other concerns. Now we are concerned with the economy, with the health and safety of the people, but we still are convinced that this is a topic to analyze further. That's why we said to our people in the council, said, okay, relax, we will organize an international group, a meeting with experts as you are, and see what they can tell us from their perspective. How can they imagine some adaptation or change of the ideas of basic rights, individual and collective, in the digitalized firms or Industry 4.5. In fact, 4.0 now, we're speaking even of 5.0. I don't know why, but anyway. So thank you for coming and participating to this discussion. I will follow your presentations and speeches, and then maybe I will have something to say myself. So thank you again. Jose Maria is supposed to speak first. Jose Maria, are you around? Yes, can you start? Yes, you have slides, good.
Yeah. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. Prima di fare il mio intervento in inglese, vorrei ringraziare il Consiglio Nazionale dell'Economia e del Lavoro per quest'invito. Professore Faioli, grazie tante per permettermi di essere oggi non qua sul Pincio a Roma, ma dalla mia casa. Devo dire che per me è un lusso e un privilegio di essere con Tiziano Treu quando io ho cominciato la mia tesi dottorale nel secolo scorso. Il suo libro sul diritto del lavoro della Comunità Europea era una guida per me, dunque essere oggi con lui era veramente per me un onore. I'm also extremely happy to share this session with so many prestigious colleagues, some of them very close friends. So everything is perfect for me, but my physical absence from Rome. In my first slide, you can see Alfonso III de Fonseca, Archbishop of Sevilla, Grand Inquisitor of Castile, and founder of my university, the University of Santiago de Compostela. You can see there the old building. One workplace, one thinking head, a clear hierarchy. Everything has changed. I even missed Industry 3.0. Now we are in 4.0, but the unions remain. The collective dimension of labor law is still here, and that's what I'm going to deal with in my short presentation. Last week, the G20 meeting took place, and parallel to it, there was a sort of expression from the IL-20, Labor 20, that under the Organization of the International Trade Union Confederation makes the common voice of the trade unions of the countries that are in the G20. In their declaration from the 25th August, they insisted in one specific point that fits perfectly with our webinar today: to promote social dialogue for workplace application of new technologies. That means that we are in a global issue. I have chosen a quote from Tommaso Marinetti. There was a time when future spoke Italian. Time and space died yesterday. We are now living in the absolute because we have already created the eternal omnipresent speed. Okay, the second part is terrible, but I would like to point the disappearance of time and space in the workplace. First of all, I have to insist in one clear difference that Michele Faioli has perfectly developed: the idea of digitalization, that it's completely different than gig economy. In this moment, we are having a digitalized conference. We are using this means of technological means to make our presentations, but we are not yet in the gig universities. Students yet cannot choose their subjects, their teachers, their timetables, as if we were some kind of Uber academic. Perhaps that will arrive, but we are not yet there. So I would like to make clear this idea. We have these two dimensions: a generalized digitalization and another field, gig economy. Think about lo spazio, the place. Digital workplace nowadays is completely different. Just think about my first slide, the old college of Fonseca, where the whole university was present. Nowadays, we have 17 buildings at University of Santiago de Compostela, and during the lockdown, I taught to my students the rudiments of labor law since this chair from my home. So something as old as university, something as classic as university, we are nearly arriving to the first 1,000 years after the foundation of the common alma mater of Bologna, has changed. The normal workplace also has changed, and we have discovered it in the most violent possible way with the pandemic. In March 2020, nearly all the productive structures in Spain, in Italy, in Europe were dramatically altered. We discovered telework, we discovered remote work in a way that nobody had ever expected, in a way that nobody had ever conceived, but in science fiction. And what happened? We discovered that labor law was years behind the reality of our activity. Nowadays, the Spanish government is preparing a first draft on remote work, and in it, collective bargaining is going to have a very important role. trade unions, workers' representations are not being left behind in this digital transformation. Space and time. I have put in the slide in italics the new working time. All of you know perfectly that working time was one of the very first issues of labor law in every country. Labor law was created to regulate working time and also, of course, child work. We thought that we had very clear the idea of working time. The European Court of Justice, and I will just point to the decision Matzak, have put the bounds of the idea of working time, that time where you are under your employer. But then digitalization changed everything. Our old ideas, our ideas that came from the physical workplace were completely altered. Concerning time, I would like to point out the draft report of the European Parliament with recommendations to the Commission on the right to disconnect from the 28th July 2020. I like to see that the European Parliament is working in summer. Nice to see that on the 28th July somebody was working. This is a very early draft. Some ideas have been put on paper. Some ideas must be developed. We all know how hard it is to take a text through the council, and we will see what is the final text, if ever. But what I like to point out here is that, once again, workers' representatives and collective bargaining are included in the text. The members of the European Parliament that have drafted this report have been very careful to include the collective dimension in the implementation of this new right. Mr. Ricardo Rodriguez, who is also here with us, has information of first-hand information about this, so I will leave to him the floor on this issue. Collective bargaining is based on dialogue. I have chosen the shortest short story ever published in Spain by Augusto Monterroso. Cuando despertó, el dinosaurio todavía estaba allí. When he woke up, the dinosaur was still there. Am I calling trade unions dinosaurs? Well, dinosaurs were the most powerful creature for thousands of years. And they died because of lack of adaptation, or, well, if you believe in the source of documentaries that we see in the History Channel about some task by the Martians, some asteroid, blah, blah. In any case, what I want to point out here is the necessity of adaptation. Reality is showing us that there are new forms of expression other than trade unions. But I have just said expression. And I want to link that with the idea of voice. There are many Twitter accounts that give voice to the workers. There are Facebook accounts where ideas, where disputes are moved. There are flash mobs. But all these digital identities are just a mask. They are like the pirate warriors of the Princess Bride. They are missing something essential that Tiziano Treu pointed out in 1970 in his book on the trade unions, the idea of subjectivity, the idea of subjectivity. You can't bargain with a Twitter account. A Twitter account is a useful tool of expression, but you can't close a deal on wages, on working time with some piece of Facebook. Indeed, there is a very interesting ruling in Spain from the Audiencia Nacional, one of our highest courts, that declared forbidden to conduct a consultation period via email. That's not a possibility nowadays under the Spanish system, so this kind of strange collective bargaining cannot take place. And we have seen that concerning gig economy. In the research project that I'm now managing under the financement of the European Commission, where I have the extremely good luck to cooperate with Judith Brockmann and have Michele Faioli as one of our external collaborators, we have discovered that the new forms of expression just protest. They have not yet been able to conclude any collective agreement. Collective agreements are, even in the field of the gig economy, still the monopoly of trade unions. In Spain, in Italy, in Denmark. I will come back later to the Danish case because it's very, very interesting. And now all that leads me to the role of elected bodies. I know that Europe has a very complicated map of workers' representatives, but being a Spaniard who is speaking supposedly in Italy, we have to take into consideration the role of our Comité de Empresa, the role of the Representanza Sindicale Unitaria, the works councils. If the workplace has been pulverized, the electoral procedure is exactly pulverized in the same way. So I think that the states should take a stand, should promote the celebration of electronic elections. The European Council does it. Eurovision does it. Some kind of digital election would enhance the participation, would reduce cost, would give better guarantees to the electors. So I think the role of the state is not only legislating, but it should promote some kind of official platform for the celebration of this kind of elections as a whole, generally. Not anymore our classic ballots, but let's go into internet to vote. As you have seen, one of my main points is collective bargaining. I once heard a very important trade unionist in Spain saying one thing: a trade union who does not bargain is not a true trade union. And I think that collective bargaining is the true expression of collective autonomy. There is also a very interesting new document from the 23rd June, the longest day of the year, a framework agreement on digitalization. I consider it very important, firstly, because of the significance of this kind of agreement. In 2019, the General Court of the European Union, in his decision, Goudrean, sorry for my Dutch, but since the times of the Duke of Alba in Spain, we have some problem with this language. In this Goudrean decision, the General Court limited very strongly the right to reach collective agreements and propose them to the Commission. The issue is being studied nowadays by the European Court of Justice, but it is creating a very important risk to this issue. That's on the form. On the content, well, it's a monographical agreement by the social partners on digitalization. You know how hard it is to finish to reach this type of agreements? But finally, the European Trade Union Confederation, the Business Europe, and all the other partners have got here. I will not develop it because of the lack of time, but I suggest all of you, if you haven't yet done it, a careful reading. I go back to my gig economy. What's happening in gig economy with collective bargaining? Okay, it's starting, but it's starting in the most primitive status of collective bargaining. It's creating a basic floor of rights for gig workers. We can't say that collective bargaining in the gig economy is an advanced collective bargaining. No. The Danish collective agreement of Hilfer.DK, very interesting, talks about working time, wages, and security of employment. I think these are the topics that have been over the table for 100 years. And that's what I want to point out in the third point of my slide, the new challenge. What about digital rights? I think that workers' representatives now must insist in this issue. We have discovered during these days of lockdown how our collective agreements hadn't anything about our right to disconnection, our computers at home, the payment of our internet connection, the use of our mobile phones to create WhatsApp groups for our students. We were using private property to conduct public functions, in my case as a teacher of a university, but in private enterprises, there was nothing about this. And the day when I discovered that my university was going to pay 10 euros to every student for the internet connection, and myself, as a worker, have not received a single euro, and I had to pay my connection to give my classes, I thought then, okay, something must be done here. But pay attention, not only in this technological side, but also in some issues like work-life balance that we have also discovered during the lockdown that are not well developed. Next week, all the schools in Spain are going to be officially opened, and nothing has been done seriously about what is going to happen when schools are closed due to the pandemics and this new dimension of work-life balance. I am a keen reader of science fiction. We have last week the trailer from Dune, when we have this phrase from the Orange Catholic Bible, "You shall now make a machine in the likeness of a human mind." In the world of Dune, machines are mistrusted. If we have seen Terminator, Skynet is going to bring us to disaster. If we have seen 2001, HAL 9000 is a clear risk. And now we have the algorithm who thinks, the algorithm who hires, the algorithm who pays, without any responsibility, because it is the machine who says that. Not our old Archbishop Fonseca, who said you are going to receive 1,000 maravedis for your teaching. No, it is the machine that with some data is going to say, okay, you are going to receive this. And that leads me to the idea of control. There is a very powerful phrase by Rudyard Kipling that was made very popular by Stanley Baldwin, a British Prime Minister, in his fight against the press. Power without responsibility has been the privilege of the harlot throughout ages. These are strong words, but to put all the power in the algorithm and nobody to be blamed by its decisions, it's exactly the same. What's my proposal in the framework of this webinar on unions functions in Industry 4.0? The bargaining of the algorithm. Workers' representatives should see, control, and know the algorithm. And there is a very, very interesting decision from the Italian State Council, the Consiglio di Stato, from the 4th February 2020. The State Council has said, in the framework of administrative hiring, that the algorithm must be known, and this has been put into contact with the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And the State Council has talked about the principle of algorithmic non-discrimination. And that's the role, I think, for trade unions, for worker representatives, to be the wardens of the algorithm. And this is just the modernization of the old rights of information and consultations. These algorithms works on these items. What do you think about it? I think this is the challenge of our future. And what about ratings? Nowadays, everything is rated. You publish a book, you are rated in Amazon. You put some pictures of a nice pizza in Instagram and people start rating it. You count the word on likes. What happens with the digital workers and their ratings, with their reputation? Should the workers' representatives know them, watch them, study them, guarantee them? I think this is the challenge of our future. I have been given just 20 minutes. I think I have finished already them, and I would like to finish with a quote from a very, very extraordinary movie, Back to the Future. Dr. Emmett Brown said this great thing where we are going, we don't need roads. Ronald Reagan used it in the speech on the State of the Union in 1986. Where we are going, we need labor law, we need unions and workers' representatives, and we need to put some imagination on the development of our industrial relations. Thank you very much. I don't know how to stop this.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Maria. Thank you very much, you all. It's great to see actually many familiar faces and also to know that we have friends, colleagues from all around the world joining us. It's a great occasion by means of this digital tool to join and to have the chance to exchange some ideas concerning unions faction, workplace regulation in Industry 4.0, and workplace digit process. We are going to start our roundtable. The time is limited, so we will do that pursuant to what we defined in our email loops. What we would like to pursue in the roundtable is what we think, I strongly think that is a potential clue for our understanding of what the connection among Industry 4.0, artificial intelligence, workplace process, and labor relations required to labor regulation today and the next future. Professor Treu highlighted in his introduction that we are talking about the possible reform of Statuto dei Lavoratori in relation to Industry 4.0. It's just a starting point, but we need to focus on what and why we need to reform Statuto dei Lavoratori in relation to Industry 4.0. So, in my view, we should focus on what artificial intelligence is requiring to the new process, the new digital process at the plant level. And we need to understand if we should do that by means of law, by means of collective bargaining, as Jose Maria stressed, or by means of a blended formula. The law asks the collective bargaining, and so the unions and the workplace agents intervene in this process. In order to understand that, we believe that the roundtable that we created is a very fruitful occasion to focus on these matters. So we will start with the German experience, asking Professor Judith Brockmann to introduce the German case and to let me know the viewpoints, her viewpoints concerning this spatial blending between workplace regulation and Industry 4.0 and the experience that they have in Germany concerning the function of Betriebsrats and the relation between the Betriebsrat and the unions at local and national level. Please, Judith, take the floor. It's
okay.
Thank you very much, please.
Thank you so much, Michele. Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak today and to share some bits of the German experience. I'm not sure. I have a high echo, so I don't know if everyone has turned off his micro. Maybe that could help, but I hope you can understand. So, as you may know, that we have this blended system in Germany, which is the social partners doing collective bargaining and co-determination at plant level, so at workplace level. And of course, Work for O is a big challenge for both different modes of workers' representation. So what we can see with all questions concerning digitalization, like more digital processes, and I mean in every stage of working. So this is true for industries, but it's also true for hospitals, for example. So there are many digital working processes today. And we can see that there are lots of issues linked to what we call Work for O that play a role or are subject to collective bargaining and collective bargaining agreements, of course. This may concern internal flexibilities, that may concern vocational training, that may concern job rotation. It may also concern data protection, like basic rights of the workers. But we can also say that we cannot identify like 2 or 3 subjects that always figure in those collective bargaining agreements, as the subjects of collective bargaining are freely left to the social partners. So they will define the level of bargaining, which is important, and they will also define the subjects and matters they bargain on. Of course, this depends also on the power of the unions in the special levels or branches. But what we can see that there are some good practice or best practice examples on company level. So there are collective bargaining agreements possible on company level that are quite like specialized on some questions in bigger companies usually. But there are also, of course, regional branch level agreements dealing with those questions. So, for example, under the initiatives that we can see, for example, in the German Trade Unions Federation, but also in some of the more specialized trade unions that are not members of that German Federation, we can see, for example, that vocational training is a big issue. For example, in the railway business. We can also see that there's a good example of Verdi and the Otto Group, which has been a catalog seller, very traditional one, but is now in online shopping, of course. And they have a firm level collective bargaining agreement, which really covers all sorts of digitalization questions of internal flexibilities, for example, or vocational training, very important. Then we can see that, for example, in the metal industries, we had those demography collective bargaining agreements, which are also dealing with all sorts of adaptation to new modes of work. So there are some very good examples that show that it's possible, but we can also see that the movement to more automatization or digitalization in the working process may lead to the creation of subsidiaries to flee or to avoid the collective bargaining agreements applicable in the parent companies, for example. So there are both tendencies that we should bear in mind when we're talking about the subject of collective bargaining from the German point of view. But then we have that second level of representation, of course, the co-determination at plant level by works councils. And the interesting point is, of course, what also Jose Maria pointed out, that to apply the German Betriebsverfassungsgesetz, the Works Constitution Act, we would need something that we can call a plant or an establishment. So we need a workplace. We need, if we cannot apply, I think that for now we can apply the legal definition of what is a workplace, which is a common place that can also, or is very much defined by the leadership or the orders given. So that might still fit. If it doesn't fit, we need to redefine what could be a workplace in terms of involvement of the employees' interests. But what we can see is that the rights that are given to the works councils still work and are adapted or adaptable to the new situations. For example, under Article 87 of the Works Constitution Acts, where we can see the enumeration of all those rights of co-determination, we have this very, very important article talking about the introduction and use of technical devices designed to monitor the behavior or the performance of the employees. And I would say in the German wording, it's determined to monitor, but we have to understand it as giving the possibility to the employer to monitor, of course. And this is what has always been done by the German courts. So we wouldn't look at the employer's intention, of course. But then we can see that every software will collect data, and nearly every software will also give the opportunity to track the activities of employees. And from that moment on, it's going to be subject of co-determination. So nearly every software, every new software, every new mode of work, which includes digital parts, will be subject to co-determination. And also, I mean, we have the more classical themes that Jose Maria mentioned earlier, like working time, of course, but also questions for the protection of health. That's what we have seen in mobile offices or home offices that are not under the German legislation, are not considered to be telework because there hasn't been an office that has been established by the employer in the private rooms of the employee, but this is an ad hoc or like very emergency remote modus of work. But it is subject to co-determination. This did not always work in the pandemic situation, but we are all aware now of the importance of that co-determination. So these are just two examples of co-determination. So I think it's very important. It's important to have, or I think it might be good to do a blended model, to have, on the one hand, the trade unions bargaining collectively and concluding collective bargaining agreements, but also allow that different kind of participation or co-determination involvement of workers who are concerned by the organization of work. So this is a very concrete thing, and employees are more likely to engage in these kind of processes because they are touched themselves. So it's nearer to them, if you want. So for also in democratic terms, I think we need both. You can't leave it only to the workplace, because then it's also a question, of course, on higher levels that can't be solved on the workplace. But it might be good to combine both. What we can say is that we have less coverage today when we look at collective bargaining agreements, but we also have less plans or establishments with works councils. So we need modes to promote both modes of representation and both levels of negotiation, and the fact to allow more digital procedures maybe might be one possibility. So I think, yeah, it's necessary, or the German experience is good to combine both in the interest of representation of workers' interests, with a focus to small and medium-sized companies, because we have those big ones who are very engaged in both on both levels, but it's more difficult because the election of works councils is left to the initiative of the workers in the workplace. And they need, as Jose Maria stressed, they need to organize. And if we want to promote this processes, it might also be one of the issues that the legislator should regulate on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. We had the chance to understand by means of the very interesting keynote speech of Jose Maria, the starting point of our analysis, the Judith viewpoint on now going on a transnational level. We have 3 colleagues coming from 3 different transnational agencies, ILO, OECD, and Eurofound, Anna Biondi, Andrea Garnero. We asked them to provide us with their knowledge concerning the development at the transnational level and also at national level of what is happening in this field. And as I said before, we are interested to a potential clue for our understanding of this blended vision between what we are calling Industry 4.0, that means also artificial intelligence, digital process, and so on. On the other side, the workplace regulation, a new workplace regulation, and activities of unions and so on. We will begin with Anna Biondi from ILO. Please, Anna, take the floor. You have 10 minutes as we already defined before this virtual panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you all for this very interesting exchange, and also exciting time indeed, you know, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Statuto dei Lavoratori. But as you see in my background, where you see Alberto Ma, you know that we celebrated last year, everybody knows, the centenary of the ILO, and indeed from what we were, Jose Maria's presentation at the beginning, you know, I have to quote our convention number 1 on working time, indeed established in 1919. And, you know, the discussion is really like, how is it possible that, you know, in 1919, we were able to establish as a first one, convention 1 on the 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, and 8 hours of socializing, and we can discuss which should be the new elements. But you know, it is extremely important to maintain the fact that you know, the fact that we should regulate. So I answered already, like the colleagues have done. You know, we need a mix of collective bargaining and regulation and law. I think that everybody agrees on this. At least I hope that we all agree on this, and then we see the balance that is necessary for maintaining, you know, valid what is the, if you want, the constitutional value of the ILO that you all know, and we all know that labor is not a commodity. And going again about the fact that you know, how do we shape this in this modern time? Again, last year, you know that the ILO adopted the centenary declaration, talking about a human-centered approach. You know, this idea was coming from Alain Soupiot. He was saying it a little bit different, and travail réellement humain. You know, that I really think that this has to be an important clue, but also in maintaining, you know, if you want, the human being at the center and not the technology as it has happened. But also we had, you know, this declaration came after a long discussion of, through a report also of the Global Commission on the Future of Work. Again, I imagine I speak about something that the colleagues have seen. But I think it was quite important that this reflection done in a tripartite way. As you know, the ILO is the only UN agency that has a tripartite component, including also workers and employers representative besides government, that, you know, the increase, the messages of the increase of investment in people capabilities, institutions of work, what we are saying, and decent and sustainable work, but also something that came out that it is the universal labor guarantee. Jose Maria was talking about the Dutch case that included the security of employment. Certainly the workers would strongly agree with that, but we were able, you know, just to have a tripartite agreement on something that I think is quite important, because we maintain the concept of fundamental rights at work, and again, freedom of association and collective bargaining, as you know, in the ILO are enabling rights. So if you don't have those, you cannot have the other. So I think this is something that has to be always very clear from our perspective, that you know, these fundamental rights are absolutely crucial, but also adequate living wage, maximum limits of working hours, unfortunately not minimum limits. This is another quite interesting discussion for those workers that only access only very few hours of work, but also safety and health. And Judith was already mentioning the importance, and indeed through the declaration there is the idea of thinking how to make sure that we put health and safety as another fundamental rights. We haven't found yet if you want, the judicial way of finding the definition, but I think it's crucial, especially in these COVID-19 times, when, you know, it's like we are, you know, all the workplace have been so much affected. So, you know, certainly collective agreements and legislation, we need to revitalize collective representation. And again, I think that what it came very strongly from the tripartite agreements is that we need to have a human in command approach to artificial intelligence. So already this one, I think it has to be very clear. We should have also an international governance system for digital labor platform to respect certain rights. I certainly agree that it's not only the platform work that we are discussing, I will take it afterwards, but also technological advance, demand regulation, and data use and algorithmic accountability that was already coming from the colleagues before. Indeed, you talk about the Statuto dei Lavoratori and the fact that already in 1970, Article 4 prohibits the introduction of video or digital system leading to surveillance unless there is a collective agreement. I think this was, you know, the vision that was already there, that I think that we need to readjust. Or I can think of what we have in 1997 in the ILO, a code of practice on the protection of workers' personal data. You know, unfortunately, nothing has happened in between, but that was the time when we were thinking, and, you know, also following what Judith was saying about the homework and how we have been also using, I've come back only last week back to the office, that now you see me in the office, but I was at home. And, you know, it's like, for example, we need to rethink Convention 177 on homework that was done for, you know, industrial work at home, I think can be rethought in terms of, you know, for whoever works at home, which are the safeguards. And, I think also on regulation, I want to quote, allow me to quote recommendation 198 on the employment relationship that happened in 2006. It was a very difficult piece of legislation to come with. But, certainly I think that at least it says which are the conditions that allow for the employment relationship to be considered. I think all of us have followed very closely what happened in California in last month with the Uber Lyft case and the judge that ordered to consider all drivers as employees. Of course, the case is not over, and but we don't know how it will end up eventually. But I think it's quite important that the judge says that we need to check which are the prompt tests to check if a worker is an employee. So I really think that this is also important. And when Jose Maria was talking about the university and the fact that, we are still in a different mode, but I say, for example, which are the employment relationship of younger teachers in universities now, and the fact that they are not provided with the same, safeguards that of an employment relationship. So in any case, in the ILO, as much as this is important and it's like the employment relationship is important, I want to go back to say that in the ILO, all workers anyway, as you know, and we use workers, not employees, because every worker should have basic rights. And as we said, starting with freedom of association and collective bargaining. So I think that our discussion, if you want, goes beyond the industry 4.0, and we should say the world of work 4.0, just like to say, we are talking, beyond industry. But I must say that all global unions have it clear that is not just workers in the gig economy. Of course, this has been very much at the center, but also all workers. And as Judith also was mentioning for the German case, I must say that I find quite interesting that Industrial as a whole say that, it's like we need to allow the benefits of workers to be, just the benefits of the industry should be socialized and not privatized as now. And also for society at large through fiscal regulation. So, how do we collectively represent technology? When we discuss this, we have also to anyway keep the global picture. For example, what happens in developing countries that are counting on the workforce for the industry that move there. So I think that we need to have a global answer. And I must say that there is no time now, but certainly the plan of action of Industrial that was, both building union powers of what we were discussing before, but also promote global framework agreements, defend workers' rights, fight precarious work and create sustainable industrial development. Of course, afterwards is very much detailed. There is not time to go into this one now. But I want also to point out to something else that you probably want to consider later on, that is this publication that was done by Professor Jelle Visser for us, for the Bureaus for Workers' Activities, that says, which is the future of trade unions, And then I think that what it is important for us as Bureau for Workers' Activities, we also want to discuss this one in an open way, because, and very clearly Professor Visser say you can go towards marginalization, dualization, meaning that only corporate power for just those who have a good job and they want to continue and they don't care about the rest, or substitution, meaning that you can have social movement that take more presence instead than trade unions, or revitalization, which it is, of course, what we hope with expanding membership, focusing more, as it has been now, on women, support from society at large. And of course, not a return to the past, but finding new ways for organizing and expressing solidarity. I find it in this discussion, and again for the very limited time that we have, also interesting to give you an example of something that the unions did it, because we speak about so much about tracking, surveillance, data, and the control. And I must say that I found very interesting that a group of trade unions have created this WeClock, it's called, and it is an app that actually wants to empower workers to look at, for example, how much time you work on your phone, what we were saying before, you know, it's like on your Saturday and Sundays, or which are your sedentary days, or which are your long commutes. And all of these, eventually you can use it for negotiation. So I think that unions are starting rethinking themselves in terms of you know, how they can contribute it to regulation, how can make sure that you know, like we go from of course global framework agreements is very important, because you know, as much as collective bargaining is important at every level, from factory level to sectoral level, to intersectoral level and national level, we need also to go beyond the national borders. And, you know, but also strengthening labor law and speedier labor courts. And so, you know, if you want, they come together. So I would say that certainly unions should be doing more. In any case, I still have my principle of freedom of association that are important, because it is true that we can, you know, find in new ways, but, you know, sometimes some basic stuff like, you know, I need to be able to meet either virtually or in person, but without employers' interference is still a basic right. So I need, in order to decide, you know, if I accept that collective agreements, for example. I think that this discussion, and I finish here because my 10 minutes are gone, is part of a larger discussion anyway. And it is about rethinking growth, rethinking consumption, rethinking the industrial policies. I mean, we need, you know, I know that you have been very active in CNEL on the recovery fund, for example, you know, just rethinking how do we want our world of work to be starting in new phases. And I think that certainly having rights at work is not only a defense of workers per se, but the defense of that democratic society that we say in the ILO is at the basis also of economic and social rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much. It was very good. And I mean, before asking Andrea to take the floor, I want to carry out a sort of cherry picking of the main ideas that we exchanged, we shared during the this first part of our virtual panel. Jose Maria, Judith, and Anna helped us to understand the difference between Industry 4.0 and gig economy, the managerial powers that an artificial intelligent machine can exercise at level plant, the very interesting query of Jose Maria concerning the basic rights that for the gig economy are bargaining in some states, in some legal systems. Judith stressed the point of the bargaining of the internal flexibility. What is a digit plant if we need to reform the notion, the legal notion of plant, and also of the workplace representation of agents. Hannah stressed the point concerning the reform that at the high level we have concerning some conventions, like the conventions of the homework. And that is very interesting if we think about the virtual work or remote work that we are performing. We all are performing this period. Anna also stressed the point concerning the legal status between employee and self-employed in the digit economy, and the future of unions and the possible function of the unions at the global level by means of global frame agreement. So this is just a cherry picking of the main ideas, is a selection, maybe a bad selection, but could be, you know, a starting point maybe for something else. I will ask Andrea Garnero, OECD, to take the floor and to offer us his labor economics viewpoint. Very interesting. We all know Andrea is a keen researcher. Please take the floor, Andrea. Thank you very much.
Good, thanks a lot. Here, I think you should see my slides. Thanks a lot for the invitation and for the very interesting debate so far. I think I will echo many of the messages that have been given already in the preview by the previous speakers. I'll speak as a, let's say, labor economist, but in fact, the OECD, we had to venture into legal issues as well. And correct me if I say something wrong or not fully precise. So we have been working at the OECD on this issue of the role of collective bargaining for a while now. And last year, in the framework of general report on the future of work, which is, let's say, I think Industry 4.0 is one dimension of what we call very generally and very vaguely the future of work. We looked at the role of collective bargaining as one of the four, let's say, policy pillars to respond and shape the future of work. So the idea that the future of work can be shaped and not just received as a given fact. And our conclusion in that report was that collective bargaining is useful to shape the future of work and determine what will happen and define, let's say, the new relationship in the labor market. And the basic things, basically, our basic conclusions was that in those countries, in those settings where social partners work cooperatively, anticipate the new challenges, under a framework guaranteeing fundamental labor rights that has been well explained by Anna Biondi from the ILO, collective bargaining has multiple advantages. First, it can help companies respond to demographic and technological changes in a flexible and pragmatic manner. So it's not just an issue of being fundamental right, it's also a flexible tool, much more flexible than what can be achieved by labor regulation. So what we say in the previous report, what we said is that the alternative to collective bargaining is not often individual bargaining. And economists would think that the alternative to collective bargaining is every worker negotiates his own working conditions. But that's not the case. What we see in reality is that the alternative is either monopsony, let's say, companies setting the labor conditions on their own, or a labor regulation. If you think the basic example is if you don't have collective agreements setting wage floors, the only alternative is minimum wage. So collective bargaining in many cases is a functional equivalent, provided that coverage is high, so that many workers and companies are covered. A second advantage of workers is that it can shape the design and definition of the new rights. For instance, a recent issue has been the right to disconnect, or improve existing ones. For instance, an entirely new focus and energy put on training and education in collective agreements. For instance, take the Italian metalworking sector, where it was introduced the individual right to training. So this is something not new, but that where collective bargaining gave a new flavor and new energy. And finally, it can complement government efforts in strengthening labor market security and adaptability. So in our work on the previous crisis, the 2008 global financial crisis, we found that collective bargaining, collective agreements were a key instrument in ensuring the so-called resilience of the labor market. So the ability of labor markets to respond to economic shocks, to unexpected economic shocks. And even these days, we see what social partners, unions, and employers can do to respond to sudden challenges such as the COVID-19. However, so this is a let's say, the big picture and what collective bargaining can do in most OECD countries, if not all OECD countries. However, there are big challenges that you know, they have been mentioned. Anna Biondi mentioned the very nice piece by Jelle Visser on the future of collective bargaining and trade unions. You know very well that trade union density has been going down for a while in all European and OECD countries. On the other end, employer organization density always remembers that it takes two to tango. So you cannot, you need both unions and employers. The decline of collective bargaining in Germany has been driven much more by the decline and the weakening of employers association than by the decline of unions. So never forget the other side of the table, because it's as important as, let's say, the worker side, the union side. Here we see that we have, let's say, not as long data as for trade unions, but you see that employers organization density has been relatively more stable, but overall coverage has been going down in the European Union as well as across the OECD, Japan and the United States. You have in the charts, but let's say you have figures for other countries. And what's more, nothing new, but we try to put some figures. Non-standard workers, so what the OECD we define non-standard workers as workers without a permanent contract, are underrepresented by trade unions, or take the other, let's say, way around, non-standard workers are less likely to be a member of the trade union. You can see that let's say the actual ratio and the adjusted one. So we control for a series of characteristics that may determine the lower level of membership to trade unions, the fact that the non-standard workers are often, let's say, have different characteristics than the standard workers. And you see that across all countries, there are differences in membership to trade unions. So that's an issue. This is the issue, an issue of, let's say, maybe it could be an issue of the effort by unions to reach out to these workers, an issue of these workers being not strong enough to join a union, the fact that they may not work in a common place where they can meet a union, join a union, and so on. But there are also some legal constraints, because something that has not been mentioned, but it's of strong importance, I would say, it's key importance in the European Union, also because it could change in the coming weeks and months, is the fact that according to the European competition law, independent workers, self-employed workers cannot cannot negotiate collectively. They can organize themselves, but negotiating collectively terms of employment could be seen as infringing competition regulation. So the lawyers certainly remember the famous Kungsten case in the Netherlands, where substitute musicians tried to negotiate together a collective agreement with the orchestra. So they were self-employed. This agreement was brought to the court by the antitrust authority in the Netherlands, and then to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And the European Court of Justice said, yes, they cannot negotiate because they are self-employed. So they are like a company, and companies negotiating together the prices of their services is a cartel, and this is against the European law. So this was somewhat narrow, let's say, interpretation of the situation. Certainly, this has become much more relevant now than at the time of Kungsten, when now we have many different self-employed workers. So it's not only self-employed workers are not necessarily only employers, but let's say they may be weak self-employed workers in the so-called gray zone between the employee status and the self-employment status. So there are something that can be done on the policy side, not only an effort to reach out to these workers by unions, but also policies have a role. First, it has already been said by the previous speakers, enforcing the correct classification of workers and fighting misclassifications. So in many cases, when you hear about the cases around platforms, in many cases about the correct classification of workers. So for instance, platform workers are not self-employed, but are employees. So this is the case that many unions try to bring to courts and they try to win the cases. In some cases they win, in some other cases they don't win. And there are also, let's say, different results according to different judgments. But so the first thing is ensuring the correct classification. And this could also be done by limiting the incentives to misclassify workers. In many cases, both workers and companies have an incentive to be self-employed, because in that cases they pay lower taxes, lower social security contributions. So there is a role of policies both in enforcing the regulation, but also in providing the right incentives. The second issue is adapting the existing regulation for workers in the gray zone. And this is an interesting area of work, because the European Union is discussing these very days what to do in this area, and something could come out in the so-called Digital Service Act, which is going to be a big thing, covering many things in the digital world by the European Union, but could also address the issue of bargaining for self-employed workers, at least in the case of digital platforms. In that case, the issue is either tailoring the labor law, and so granting, let's say, creating sort of special forms of employment, for instance, the so-called dependent contractors in Canada, who are self-employed workers, but who, according to the Canadian labor law, can negotiate collectively, or giving specific exemptions from the prohibition to bargain collectively in competition regulation. So saying that this kind of workers under these conditions can negotiate, and this is not a cartel. So this is something that policymakers around the world are considering, and where an intervention could be used. Finally, it has been said, but I'll repeat it, trade unions and employers organizations are trying to change, are trying to diversify their strategies, adapting the structure to reach non-standard workers. Many unions over the last 20 years, until 20 years ago, in some cases, self-employed workers were forbidden to join a union by the unions themselves. The unions didn't want the self-employed workers. Slowly, many unions have opened themselves to self-employed workers, have opened proper branches to represent these workers in many countries, Spain, Italy, France, and so on. And new vehicles are being created in many countries, new alternative forms of representation. But as Jose Maria said at the beginning, these alternative forms of representation have the downside that they cannot negotiate. To negotiate, you need a union. So they can express voice, they can provide a platform for workers, but they cannot negotiate. And finally, employers' organizations are also trying to respond to the challenge, because many new forms of work and business, like platforms, represent a challenge for many companies too. So it's an issue that of concern for them. The good thing, I think, is that collective bargaining has already proven in the past to be relatively flexible and able to change. If you think since a century in the culture and creative industries, there is collective bargaining for non-standard workers, for self-employed. In the US, still now, the strongest union is the Actors Studio or the Writers Guild. And these unions, they represent workers that are non-standard, and they are very strong. And even recently, the case of temporary work agency, I think, is an interesting case when we talk about platforms, because temporary work agencies in the 70s were as disruptive as the platforms are now. They invented a new relationship of work, a triangular relationship of work. The unions didn't like them. Temporary work agencies were at risk of being banned by public authorities. But at the end, through collective bargaining, they managed to first acquire or get social peace, let's say, gain social peace, and second, to regulate the sector as they liked, joined with the union, but as they liked, instead of having a single regulation in the law. So I think these are examples where collective bargaining is already proven to be flexible. More you can find in our reports. Now I'll turn over the floor to Michele. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for your speech. Thank you for your insights. We have the last speaker, our friend Ricardo Rodriguez of Eurofound, and we all should thank Eurofound because by means of their own reports, investigations, they are helping us to understand that intelligent robots and digit process at the plant level are no more an esoteric topic. They are there, and they are very good in explaining us by means of their investigations that Ducati or Lamborghini plants has his own intelligent robot, or Merkel and so on, Merck plants and so on, Bayer. I mean, at plant level, we all are now aware that there is something that is changing. Process, digital, intelligent process on one side, and on the other side, intelligent machine. And as Andrea highlighted, the problem is how the CBA, that is the more flexible and functional, he used these words, the more flexible and functional tool can adapt the protections, workers' protection, to the new technology. So I would like to ask Ricardo to take the floor and also to give in his 10 minutes as another just an insight of what they are discovering at Eurofound level. Thank you very much. Ricardo, please take the floor.
Thank you, Michele. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I'm happy to see also very good friends again. And also we have met with Claudio just 1 hour before in another webinar, so it's a busy day in the end. So I'm not able to speak Italian yet, but I'm making some progress. It's quite difficult, of course, to speak the last one. Many things have been said. I have prepared some slides that I can share very, very quickly, just to support what my thoughts really about that. I try to follow the title of the webinar. It's a little bit difficult because we don't have any of us a crystal ball about what is the future of the unions, and we can also think about the research done in this field, but times are quite complicated now, and this is something that we should take into account when we talk about unions' function in the future. First of all, I will follow the distinction that Jose Maria has made very clever, very smart, in terms of distinguishing the gig economy and other stuff. So we are talking about technological change. I would like to refer to as technological change because this is probably the most important thing that we have on the table now, and I will come back to later. Let me check. Yep. Yeah, I think you see my presentation. It will be very quickly. Well, basically, I will talk about technological change. Then I will talk about, because Andrea was talking about quality bargaining and its relations, and finally some last remarks about that. The first thing when we talk about the future of union, or how you can regulate in Italy the new workers' representatives prerogatives, for instance, or what is the function of unions, is to understand what we're talking about, because we have seen a lot of confusion over the past years about basically the impact of platform work on gig economy. We can talk about that, and of course the other very deep strand in terms of the effects of technological change, because everything was covered by the term digitalization, and it is a very different issues. I will go very quickly because I'm afraid that Claudio already knows it very well, that we started 4 or 5 years ago, and the first thing we did was to distinguish what we're talking about. And then in terms of technological change and digitalization, we distinguish these three main fields, main impact, these drivers of change, basically. We talk about automation, which is probably the most well known, the impact of robots, et cetera, in the industry 4.0. We talk about digitization, which is another stuff, another type of technologies. And we finally talk about the platform works. Basically, automation is relatively quite clear because the impact on work is because it's the replacement of labor. And this is the typical stuff where a lot of fear over the past year with a lot of predictions that probably none of us have been fulfilled so far. And then also we have this other cluster of technologies that we call it digitization, which are much more related about what Jose Maria was talking in terms of the impact on workplace level. So digitization are those technologies that transform physical objects and documents into bits and vice versa. And platforms are clearly the word of the platform work, platform economy. So to understand clearly, we have these three types of drivers of change. Then we talk about automation, the replacement of human labor by machines. Digitization is about processes. Typical example is 3D printing, the most well known, but there are others, virtual reality, etc. And platforms that did all this work. Of course, this is just a theoretical approach because even automation, digitization, and platforms can be mixed and are mixed very often. But the most important message that we try to give basically to trade unions is, okay, let's go to separate it because the effects, the impacts of that at workplace level are very, very different. And you need to make an agenda in order to negotiate whatever, you need to be able to distinguish the effects of this. Of course, well, I will quickly not talk about things, but just to say a few words about the platform work. And this is what we are talking about. And this is very important, we understand, for unions because it's very symbolic, because it's really something that can put upside down the collective bargaining. But this is the reality according to the last survey done. Claudio knows that we in Eurofound, we have been really studying a lot the platform work, the platform economy. We have published a lot of reports about that. We, in the end, after struggling a lot with all the different types of platform work, we distinguished 10 types, 10 basic types, because we can count until 27. The first classification we did was 27 different types of platforms, because there are many different of them. And so this, I'm not going to spend time on this, but this is something important also, so to know the importance. I think this is well known, the impact on representation and voice of the platform economy. I think Jose Maria has published a lot. Many labor law professors are very happy now to talk about this new phenomena. Basically, the most important discussion has been said before is about what is the definition of worker in this context, etc., etc. And this is a mess, normally speaking. So we should have and wait. Even there are interesting developments. You know, the European Commission is planning to do something about that. But I'm not very confident about the digital app services that Andrea mentioned before. It's a difficult thing. Probably they are planning, the Commission is planning other goals and other objectives for this very important piece of legislation that will be adopted in the second quarter of 2021. Let me just spend a few words here. So let's go aside the digital, the platform economy, the platform work. Then we have 115 million workers covered by collective bargaining in Europe. It's about 60% more. Data are very complicated. and most of them working in manufacturing in industry 4.0. And they are impacted work processes and workers, and of course also human resources, by the way, that is important view, by technological change. And that has started a long time ago in some sectors, in automation, etc., but it's also being deployed and implemented in other manufacturing and in the services sector, by the way. And of course, leaving aside other new businesses of the technological giant, etc., etc. And what happens here in terms of collective bargaining? Jose Maria has said before something about that. So really, it's difficult to find so far. And we are, because it's our work, we are doing that, and we are following what are the developments of technological change in terms of collective bargaining at sector level and company level in all member states, in 27 member states. And we have found really very little samples of provisions saying, okay, this is the way in which employers and workers representatives, trade unions, in a collective agreement are going to implement or introduce new technology, whatever. There are really very few examples about that, and they are not representative, either at company level or at sectoral level. There's some reason for that, in my view. First of all, because basically the employers and trade unions or worker representatives at company level are really, so they are negotiating, still negotiating in terms of wages, probably working time. This is the most important issue on the table when they start negotiating. And second point, to go quickly, is because collective bargaining is and Andrea knows very well, it's a very complex machinery, and it takes time to adapt to the change and to implement this change. Most of the collective agreements they take for 2, 3, even more 4 years. And these new realities are being implemented over the past 4 or 5 years. So we are more and more watching out new collective agreements dealing with this topic, with the impact of technological change, either basically on the impact of automation, but not only. My theory is that technological change, the introduction of technologies, automation, or whatever, is taking place at different levels. There are many agreements that they don't talk about new technologies, they don't talk about technological change or digitalization. What they are doing is trying to adapt collective agreements to this technological change, basically through other areas in the collective agreement. Basically, in my view, is working time, basically distribution of working time, but closely linked to new skills. And then you have examples in many countries, not many, but there's a few of them, interesting one, that they are starting to deal with this technological change, that adapting working time, for instance, now teleworking, and of course with the need to reskill policies, training, retraining, because this is important, at least so far until the last year, we see with the COVID-19 effect. I put some examples here in car makers, but there are others. I think in Italy too, the former Telecom, it's now Team, something like that, and other examples, Lamborghini, one of them clearly. But there are, and this is the way in which even people, we are a little bit old here, we remember in the 90s or 80s in the last century, when the ICT started, the first laptops really changed the way of work in many companies, and it was called new technologies, and there were a lot of agreements about new technologies, but I think this is not the case now. So because basically the technologies are very different, and they're very different in the impact of the processes, the working processes, but also in the production processes. And of course, because there are, as Anna said before, a lot of changes in global supply chains, the way in which the company, we understand the company in a different way. probably than 10 or 15 years ago. So all these changes are related to the way in which technological change is being adapted at company level, sometimes at sectoral level, but mostly at company level. So just to finish, I don't have time, but about trade union density, we have done a work trying to organize the classical clusters, the Nordic cluster, the Gel-Visser cluster, by the way, because we understand that after all the things that have happened over the past decade, there have been changes in the way, this classification is not useful anymore to distinguish the differences to the industrial systems in the 27 member states. Here it's still the 28. But I don't have time, but my message here is, okay, take care with the data, because as Andrea knows very well, it's very difficult to capture reliable data. We have analyzed the same series in terms of starting in 2000, and we didn't stop in 2008, but we did in 2014. We have analyzed the last recovery economic period, which is interesting because it has been an interesting period in terms of job creation. Most of the member states have get a lot of jobs. And this has impacts probably in the way in which trade union density is calculated, and even, of course, in collective bargaining. I don't have to, so this is exactly the same class. Okay, this is a complex issue, and when you see the corporate frame, so this is our cluster, our classification is based on our industrial relation index that we have published in Eurofound, and we think that it works, even it's really a complex issue to classify and to cluster the 27 member states, the 27 industrial system in the member states. I would say something important. Probably we have finished the European company survey, fortunately, just before the outbreak of the disease health outbreak. So we still work, and we are working on that. We will present the results of the European company survey in November. Again, unfortunately, will be an online presentation. You will be invited. And for the first time, we asked the managers and also the workers' representatives about digitalization, because this thing, the last wave was in 2014. Well, the company, the European company service is very important. We have 27,000 respondents, and we are covering only the establishment with more than 10 workers. But you can see some examples of the new questions related to digitalization. We have analyzed that for the first overview report that will be presented. Probably we don't have time to analyze all these questions, but we will follow with secondary analysis, and we will see how at workplace level management are implemented with or without direct or indirect employee representation, all these changes that are happening on the ground. Just a few examples of this, the years of experience. For instance, this is about, we distinguish between workers' representatives and trade unions. I think if I remember well, this is something important because when we talk about the future of trade union, you should understand what is the state of affairs of what are the unionists, what are the consequences of, for instance, gender and age is important factor. I think that only 2% of the respondents have more than 12 years acting as unionists, and approximately 4 out of 10 have less than 4 years. and it does very well quickly. Well, this is an example of the respondents by trade union, Works Council, and a third category, which is a little bit difficult, is a mixed category of staff delegators, etc., etc. That's interesting because this is when we ask the trade union membership within establishment, and this is related to the trade union membership or trade union density, trade union membership in this case, but 25% of employees representatives report that none of the employees within the establishment belong to a trade union, which is an important element to take into consideration. No? 30% say they believe the trade union membership is less than 30%, and a high degree of trade union membership of more than 80% reported that is reported by employee representatives in about 12% of the establishment. Just to conclude, what technological change? What is important in terms of key messages? I think that, as I said before, there's a discussion. What is the right level to approach technological change in terms of collective bargaining, for instance, sectoral level or company level, according to a trade union survey in 2017, 2018. In principle, it seems that the approach that's taken is at company level. Probably in some sectors, some aspects concerning training policies, reskilling policies could be adapted, but this is the way that in principle things are taking place. I said something before about HR, human resources policy, because we are talking about trade union, but I think that when I meet human resources managers, they are a little bit lost too, about the futures, even about their own function in this changing world of digitalization. They are more using people analytics and other web tools and etc., artificial intelligence, and they have exactly the same question that trade unions do themselves. So that is important to take into account this point, because HR management function is again changing and playing a role that probably it's not the same that ever. And I fully agree with Andrea, of course. Really, collective bargaining is the way in which the best way to shape all the challenges stemming from the recent, the forthcoming transitions, the climate policies, of course, digitalization, and so on. This is something I've said also because Maya said something. We are working with the European institutions and with the European Parliament and the right to disconnect, and I could say a few words about that. But also what we see under the German presidency of this semester is really a certain impulse, a push for collective bargaining, for social dialogue. They have been working with the European Economic Social Committee, promoting some opinions, and we think that because now is the German presidency, next is the Portuguese one, which is also quite in favor of promoting collective bargaining, that they want to really give this push in order to promote. Because when we talk about collective bargaining, really, okay, we say and employers and unions, but we cannot forget that over the past decade, basically governments, many governments, and of course under the coverage of the European semester and the European Union, they have really promoted an unorganized decentralization. OECD is quite aware of that because they have also published these studies. And so probably it would be the right time that member states and governments in some countries where collective bargaining is very weak and even social dialogue frameworks are very poor, they also promote collective bargaining. It's not only about structural weaknesses of the social partners at company level. So this is something that could be done also at government level. Well, and just my last message here is basically that on top of the digital challenges and the concerns about what is the impact of technological change and what is the function of working of unions in this era. Also, we have this enormous health crisis. And one of the effects, for instance, is the way in which telework has been.
Ricardo, I'm sorry. Yeah, Ricardo, I'm sorry. We should stay in the time that we defined.
Absolutely. I finish here. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry very much. It was very interesting, but we I don't know if you are going to the conclusion.
No. Just conclusion. I have concluded. That's fine. Thank you very much. Sorry for.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope we can meet soon in Rome or wherever, but for sure by means of this digit tool. I will ask Claudio Lucifora to take the floor for the conclusion. Thank you again for everything.
Thank you, Michele. Can you hear me? Good. So let me thank our guests on behalf of CNEL, Jose Maria, Judith, Anna, Andrea, and Ricardo for the very interesting and stimulating discussion. I've learned many things. I think also the people that are following us on the YouTube channel managed to learn very many things about the world of work. We have learned that we shouldn't talk about the industry 4.0, but the world of work 4.0. We learned that there are many dimensions of innovation and technological progress. So we have automation, we have digitization, we have platform, and although these are blurred in somehow, we should have very clear that they are different things if social partners want to engage in negotiation along these different dimensions. We haven't discussed very much COVID-19 crisis, but I think that the COVID-19 crisis is a kind of accelerator of all these processes. So what the crisis has done is push forward all these latent processes and put forward in front of us these great challenges. So social partners, which is what we are discussing today, face big challenges, but these are also big opportunities. There are so many things that are changing the functioning of the labor market, in the way work is organized, and all these different changes in aspects and transformation cannot and probably should not only be regulated by law. So there is a big role that social partners have to do to provide input in defining new rules. Now, it was quite interesting to see the different tension between the discussion put forward by law experts and economists. Economists like myself and Andrea see in collective bargaining the possibility to reach a huge flexibility, which, you know, legislation cannot. While the main preoccupation of many of the law experts that intervened was to recall the importance of the fundamental rights. So the way I see it, in a way that, you know, the law should provide some kind of support. And this is exactly when Anna referred to the working time directive, or if we think in terms of minimum wage. So all these rules, from the point of view of economists, are sort of inefficient. It's the second best way to deal with inefficiency. bargaining is much better. But of course, we need probably both. We need the minimum, the legal minimum wage, and then we need a negotiation to set the standards around many issues. So these challenges that social partners face to set new rules and new bargaining issues are very many. Some have been mentioned, but let me just go over these challenges. So the main one is working hours. We heard that many countries are thinking of introducing new laws, setting some standards for the number of days or hours that should be worked. All efforts set a legal working time in the past didn't work very well. So I think the social partners should do a good job here. Health and safety, wage negotiation. In times of deflation, for example, in Italy, we are asking ourselves, this is the big conflict over the renewal of the collective contracts that almost 2/3 of them have expired and wait to be renewed. Employers say, well, there is no inflation, there is no increased price. What should we negotiate at the national level, at the sectoral level? Only other things can be negotiated, but this should be done at the firm level. So there is an issue that has been going around for a long time, whether what is the appropriate or the optimal level of negotiation. Should be sectoral, should be national, should be firm level. There is the whole issue of digitization, innovation, and many in the discussion talk about bargaining the algorithm. So going to the source of the process that are governing these new ways of administrating and regulating the way work is organized. And the old wine in new bottles has been mentioned, the homework. Now we call it telework, we call it smart work. But in the end, how should we regulate these new forms of organizing work? And the rights to disconnect. There are many issues connected with training, the support scheme like short-time schemes and benefit system. So after decades of erosion of social partner representativeness, Andrea mentioned that we should not only look at trade unions, but also employer representatives. Now, social partners face a new era, I think, in which industrial relations could gain and find a renewed attention and new opportunities to play an important part. And they have done it, because I'm talking in particular for the Italian experience. Many important protocols in terms of health and safety, in terms of working organization have been signed during the COVID crisis, in the early phase of COVID crisis, and these have been adopted in a way by the law. So the challenges are very important. Some requires big thinking, like Judith mentioned. We need to identify a plant. We need, even if it's a virtual place, we need to identify what is it in order to have a work council. And we also need a new procedure. So I mentioned a new era of social representation, social partners, but organizing workers and firms, particularly in countries like Italy, where we have many micro enterprises, is very difficult. So we need new molds. How can we do it? And we probably need this digital procedure for representation. We need some virtual places to do things that we were used to do before, in new ways. And I believe that even if and when, I hope this crisis will be soon over, these digital tools will be side by side to our more traditional ways of doing. And one final, I think, very important issue has been the subtle divide between employees, workers, self-employed. You know, what is it? There is a gray area, which, however, makes as a fundamental importance, as Andrea Garnero reminded us, because of cartels and competition. And so we need new criteria, which in fact, mildly in Italy in the last few years, the laws try to strike to identify the workers that are not self-employed and they are not employees, but they are somewhere in between, and find new ways to regulate. So my final claim and call for the future of this is flexibility. So the world of work is changing rapidly and is changing in a fragmented way. We cannot think and regulate it as it was in the case of an industrialized world. This is not anymore the case, and we need flexible ways. And I think social partners, industrial relations, and collective bargaining are one of the best way to achieve this goal. Michele, I'm done. I leave you the floor. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, you all. Again, I'm very happy that we have this occasion to meet, this opportunity to exchange ideas. I hope we can repeat soon. CNEL is happy to organize this kind of virtual panel in order to advance the world of work. Thank you very much again, and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.